What's going on, everybody? This is Sean of Raw Select Music. Today I want to talk about Run the Jewels 1, 2, and 3. The reason I wanted to talk about Run the Jewels 1, 2, and 3 was because Run the Jewels 4 just came out recently, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from as a Run the Jewels fan. And 2, even despite the fact that I started my Raw Select Music blog back in 2015, I never really got around to fully exploring my thoughts and opinions on all of the Run the Jewels albums. So now that I have this YouTube channel, I figured now would be as good a time as any to go back and revisit 3 of my favorite hip-hop albums from the last 10 years, and let you know why not only I think this is some of the best hip-hop that came out in the last 10 years, why I think their story is just one of the most fascinating that's out there in terms of going from where they started to becoming the critical darling of both the mainstream and underground world of hip-hop. So, with that being said, yeah, let's talk about these guys. So, my first introduction to Run the Jewels actually came before the release of the project. I was, a huge fan of LP, going all the way back to his Definitive Jux days, even before it was called Def Jux, and being a fan of not only him, but all the artists on his now legendary defunct underground hip-hop label. I was always a fan of his off-kilter style of production, and I really liked his tongue-twisting lyrics and some of his really obscene, pointed jabs at whatever target that he was focused on. My introduction to Killer Mike actually came from rap music, hearing that LP was going to be doing the production for that album, and while I never got around to actually listening to it, I did really like the track Big Beast featuring T.I. I love the production on it, and I love the hammer-like force of Killer Mike's straightforward yet extremely hard delivery. And then when I found out that they were going to team up and start a project together called Run the Jewels, initially I thought it was just going to be a one-off and then they would split off and go back to doing their own thing. Shortly after that, Run the Jewels 2 came out, and then it seemed like after that, this was going to be a thing. It was no longer just a novelty project. It was going to be them moving forward as a group. Now, there's a lot more detail that I'm skipping over right now, and I highly recommend that you go check out the Adult Swim mini documentary that they did on Run the Jewels, because I really think it captures all of the major points into how Run the Jewels came about. It's a fascinating story, and it just becomes even more fascinating when you realize where both of these guys were in their already fairly lengthy careers, and how Run the Jewels basically gave them a second lease on life. So if you want to check that out for yourself, head over to my WordPress and Steemit blogs, because that's where I'll be posting music links as well as any video links that I think are worth checking out. Now, the one thing that I want to get across before I dive into any of these albums is I think in broad strokes, there is a formula that Run the Jewels has always worked with. To quote one of my favorite video game critics out there, the broad strokes are the same, the nipples have been tweaked a little bit. And I think that's fairly true for Run the Jewels all the way up until their 4th album. LP's production, to me, has always sounded like a weird hybrid of Vangelis, I think I'm saying that right, with the Bomb Squad. So there's these real synth-heavy science fiction-like sounds mixed in with these really noisy, abrasive, aggressive, sometimes musical and sometimes anti-musical elements in his work. LP seems to really love noisy sounds, whether it's heavy bass or siren-like synths. His production work has always had an element of being both extremely hard and also being extremely noisy at the same time. And he manages for the most part, to balance that line quite nicely. There are times where he will cross over the edge and just go into straight annoying territory, or at the very least, annoying for some people. I think my threshold for that kind of stuff is actually pretty high. But I think in the broadest sense of describing LP's production production sound, that's how I would describe it. In terms of a lyrical front, I think LP has definitely had more of a wordsmith approach to it, where he loves wrapping his lines up in multiple metaphors that occasionally can be very straightforward, but then in other times they can be extremely snarky and extremely difficult to decipher. But the moment that you do pick up on it is the moment that you find yourself rewinding it just to hear it again. And as I stated before, Killer Mike seemingly has a much more straightforward style. It's going for that very visceral, very aggressive, and I think he is the perfect foil for LP. So with all that being said, I think I've covered sort of the broad strokes of their music. I guess the only other thing to cover would be sort of the lyrical topics in their records, but I think I'm gonna save that for when I actually talk about their music. Let's kick things off with Run the Jewels 1. Run the Jewels 1 to me is the perfect first outing. While listening to this record again recently, the one thing that I discovered is I really like it, and there really isn't a skippable track on here. I think the more braggadocious tracks on here work really well. I think some of the more poignant, more introspective, and more political moments on here work really well, and I think they mixed in really, really well, and it never feels like the flow of the record is disturbed by any of this. The one thing that I will say that stands out to me about this record is while all the tracks on here are good, they never get to the level of excellence that some of their later records will be. I don't feel like there's quite the refinement in the actual production, and a lot of that, as I understand it, was because a lot of these beats were made even before Run the Jewels was a thing. These were actually sort of hard drive beats that LP had that he was saving for whatever project that came along. That in and of itself, I think, kind of makes this much more of an LP project featuring Killer Mike. In terms of presence, I think LP is a lot stronger on here. Killer Mike definitely holds his own and definitely knows when to punch the listener in the throat, and definitely gets in some really good lines on here. But to me, overall, I feel like LP really steals the show, and it definitely feels like he's the most comfortable over these kinds of productions. Lyrically, there's some political moments on here. There's some revolutionary calls to action, but I also feel like this is one of the more introspective and more focused on emotion than some of their other records. And the one that really sticks out to me is Sea Legs, because it's such a different track from anything else that Run the Jewels would go on to, but it's so much in the wheelhouse of something that you would have heard on I'll Sleep When You're Dead. It's definitely one of my favorite tracks on here, and the brag rap tracks on here are some of my absolute favorite tracks on here. Get It, Run the Jewels, Banana Clipper, 36-inch Chain, Twin Height Back featuring Chest Rockwell actually represents some of my all-time favorite Run the Jewels tracks. LP comes in with his usual tongue twister. Yeah, I just came up with that. And Killer Mike is the perfect counter punch to that and just goes straight for the head and straight for the gut. And it works absolutely perfectly as these two push and pull off of each other. Ultimately, my only minor complaint of this record is I don't feel as it's as strong as the material that they would put out later. But as it stands, it's still a very good record, and definitely a great sign of what would come on their next record, which I ultimately swear is their best record to date. So now we come to my personal favorite. This is Run the Jewels 2. This feels like them delivering on the promise of what Run the Jewels 1 represented. It's basically everything that was on that record, tailored more as a sound for both of them rather than just LP featuring Killer Mike. And it really shows that within the year that it took to create this record, that they knew exactly what they wanted to do with this project and make the most confident effort to date. In terms of openings, is I don't think they've released a stronger record yet. Jeopardy, Oh My Darling, Don't Cry, Blockbuster Night Part 1, and Close Your Eyes and Count to Fuck represent easily the strongest run of tracks that I think they've had on any album up until this point. And while it does dip a little bit in terms of energy, I really like All My Life, and I think it's a nice little break in the non-stop visceralness of the opening of this record. But then it leads back into Lie, Cheat, Steal, which is another highlight track on here, which leads back into Early, which is definitely one of the more poignantly political songs that they've made. And I really like the difference in perspectives in the way that LP presented his side of the story, as well as Killer Mike giving a first-hand account on his side of the story. And then it once again goes back into two of my favorite tracks on this record. All Due Respect with Travis Barker on drums, which I think is still one of the hardest tracks that they have, and some of the greatest bars that they've had in terms of like just straight battle rap bragginess, which leads into the sleaziest thing these guys have done yet, which is Love Again with Gangsta Boo. And I do love the trade-off between the sleaziness of LP and Killer Mike, and then on the opposite end, Gangsta Boo giving her perspective and also managing to match LP and Killer Mike in terms of the level of just domination that's going on this record. It does lead into what I think are two of the slower and weaker moments on here. Crown, on a lyrical level, I think is really great, but I think in terms of an instrumental, it's just not that interesting. And ultimately, Angel Duster as a closer doesn't do that much for me. But everything up to Love Again to me is nearly flawless. I think this is still to this day the strongest record that they've made, and it's easily the Run the Jewels project that I've listened to the most up until this point. So with this record making the hype for Run the Jewels 3 so incredibly high, it was pretty easy to be let down a little bit. Alright, I saved the most controversial for the last part of this video. Run the Jewels 3 is still my least favorite record of the four that they've released up until this point, which is not to say by any stretch of the imagination that it's bad. I actually went back and listened to it again for the purposes of doing this video and discovered there were actually a lot more tracks on here that I enjoyed than I had previously thought. The main one that sticks out to me is Panther Like a Panther, which originally I just didn't really enjoy. I thought the intro was a little bit weird, and I was kind of in a different headspace when this record came out. I really wasn't listening to that much aggressive music at that time. It sort of shifted away into different territory. But after listening to Run the Jewels 4, it inspired me to go back and listen to this record and give it another chance. I'm really glad it did. Similarly to Run the Jewels 2, I feel like the opening on this record is absolutely perfect. Down, Talk to Me, Legend Has It, and Call Tickerton are probably my four favorite tracks on here. Specifically, Call Tickerton is one of my all-time favorite, more experimental tracks on this record. And truth be told, I think that's the one thing that's very, very unique about this record. It really does seem like LP was trying out some new ideas, moving away from a little bit more of his boom bap roots meets a newer, more sort of trap sound. And it really feels like he's experimenting in that style of trap just within his own particular set of sound and particular set of skills. And when it works, it really works. Legend Has It is still one of my all-time favorite get hype songs, and it contains some of my favorite brag rap lines of all time. Panther Like a Panther really grew on me. I think it is probably the hardest beat on here, and it is definitely one of my favorite late album moments on this record. So with that being said, however, I do think this album is by far their most uneven. For one, Hey Kids, the beat really just feels sort of unfinished. And I could say the same thing for Don't Get Captured and Thieves, Scream the Ghost. I feel like the instrumental on here is just really distracting and not all that interesting. And quite honestly, it annoys me so much. I find myself not paying attention to any of the lines on this song. And even for as many times as I've tried going back to this record, I'm still constantly distracted by how unfinished and how uninteresting the beats are that inevitably I end up skipping these tracks. Thankfully, the record does swing back around with 2100. I think this is one of the cooler, more experimental moments on here, and I love the fact that LP was playing with a 6/8 swing on here. I really like the menace of this track, and the way that LP and Killer Mike flow on this is so good. The other thing that I really wanted to say was Stay Gold, I think, has one of the weakest hooks that I've heard on any record, and it always has turned me off. And every time that the album hits this point, despite the fact that I actually like the beat on here, the verses on here don't do anything for me. I don't like the hook on here as well. It's just kind of irritating, and it feels kind of forced and lazy. It's just not that interesting. And then the other thing that I'll say is that I feel like the album finishes on a rather disappointing note, similarly, there we go, to Run the Jewels 2. The last two tracks on here just don't do anything for me. Thursday in the Danger Room tries to be a little bit different, kind of exploring almost like an industrial post-rock sort of sound, and it's kind of Kamisi, Washington. I'm terrible with names, folks. Sorry about that. Really just leaves a flat performance that doesn't do anything for me, which is quite surprised considering the caliber of musician that he is. And then the last track on here, Report to Your Shareholders and Kill Your Masters, again, just leaves me cold. It's not that it's bad, it's just not memorable, and ultimately these last two tracks kind of leave me flat. So overall, I'm just kind of conflicted with this record. In terms of lyrical content, on both sides, LP and Killer Mike are as good in terms of memorable lines, and overall, and I think I might be alone on this, it actually feels like Killer Mike and LP were a little tired on this record. It didn't really feel like it had the same gusto and the same punch that their previous records had. That being said, it's by no means a bad record. I just think it's the weakest of their four up until this point. I know a lot of people out there disagree with me, but that's my basic stand on their first three records. Look forward to my thoughts and opinions on Run the Jewels 4 coming very soon. But for now, that's gonna be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching. If you've listened to any of these three records, let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. If you want to check out any of these albums for yourself, please head over to my WordPress or Steemit blogs, because that's where I will be posting videos to any of the records that I talk about on this channel. Please head over to Mixcloud, where you can check out Raw Select Radio, the audio component of this YouTube channel. You can also check out the live streams archives as I upload them to this channel as well. Follow the eye, and you can see some of the stuff that I don't get a chance to talk about on this channel. Links to everything, as always, down in the description. But that's gonna be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. So until then, peace out!